That woman's husband belongs to me now, and everyone in this room knows it." Chloe Carter said it into a live microphone, stone cold, smiling, standing in the middle of a 600-person black tie gala with a champagne glass raised toward Victoria Whitmore like a weapon. She didn't whisper it. She didn't hint at it. She announced it sharp, deliberate, loud enough to bounce off every chandelier in that ballroom. Then she laughed, drained her glass, and looked straight at Victoria, waiting for tears, waiting for collapse, waiting for the wife to break. Victoria didn't blink, because Chloe Carter had just made the most catastrophic mistake of her entire life, and she was the only person in that room who didn't know it yet. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew your whole story, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this reaches. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because this story is just getting started. Victoria Whitmore had known about the affair for 112 days. She hadn't stumbled across a text message. She hadn't hired a private investigator. She hadn't cried into a pillow or confronted her husband in the kitchen at midnight with shaking hands and a broken voice. She had simply paid attention. And attention, when applied by a woman like Victoria Whitmore, was a far more dangerous instrument than any private investigator money could buy. She noticed the small things first. The way Daniel's shirt smelled different, not like another woman's perfume, not yet, but like the particular combination of someone who had freshly showered before coming home. The way his phone, which had once lived face up on the kitchen counter, like it had nothing to hide, now traveled everywhere with him. Face down password changed to something she had never been told. The way he laughed differently on certain phone calls, lighter, younger, almost unrecognizable, before stepping outside onto the terrace and pulling the glass door shut behind him. She noticed. She catalogued. She said nothing. Because Victoria Whitmore did not come from a family that screamed. She came from a family that watched. And then when the moment was exactly right, they moved. The night of the Fairmont Royal York Gala began the way every major social event in their world began, with preparation that took hours and was designed to look effortless. Victoria sat in front of her vanity mirror at 5 in the afternoon, watching her reflection as her stylist worked. She wore no expression in particular, just the calm, focused face of a woman thinking through something no one else in the room was equipped to understand. Her personal assistant, a sharp young woman named Priya, appeared in the doorway holding a tablet. "The car is confirmed for 7:30. Your table is front and center. Daniel already called ahead to confirm your seats. And—" Priya paused for exactly half a second. "Chloe Carter is also on the guest list tonight, under the Hayes Dynamics corporate sponsorship block." The stylist's hands continued moving through Victoria's hair. Victoria's expression did not change by a single millimeter. "I see," she said. "Do you want me to—" "No." Victoria met Priya's eyes in the mirror. "Leave it exactly as it is." Priya gave one careful nod and disappeared back into the hallway. She had worked for Victoria for 3 years. She had learned early that when Victoria said leave it, she did not mean ignore it. She meant she had already handled it in ways that didn't require anyone else's involvement. Victoria looked back at her own reflection. She thought about Daniel. About the man she had married 12 years ago in a ceremony at her parents' estate in Connecticut, a ceremony her father Augustus had organized with the meticulous precision he applied to every significant event in the Whitmore family history. She thought about what Daniel had looked like then, 32 years old, brilliant in a scrappy, hungry way that had genuinely attracted her, full of ideas and ambition and a charm that felt real because it was backed by genuine intelligence. She had loved him. She wanted that to be clear, at least to herself, sitting alone in that room with the stylist's hands moving through her hair and the city beyond the window preparing itself for evening. She had loved him. This was not a woman who had married for strategy and was now executing an exit. This was a woman who had loved a man, watched him change in ways she couldn't control, and was now doing what her family had always taught her to do when love was no longer enough to hold a situation together. You protect what matters. You protect it quietly, and then you rebuild. Daniel had been in the adjoining room getting dressed. She could hear him moving around, hear the low murmur of his voice on the phone, that lighter, younger laugh again, brief, quickly suppressed when he remembered where he was. She had heard it and felt the familiar twin sensation, a small, dull ache in her chest, and underneath that something colder and more focused. He emerged from the adjoining room at 6:45 looking handsome in a way that had once made her genuinely proud. Dark suit, silver tie hair touched with just enough gray at the temples to make him look distinguished rather than old. He was 51, and he looked 45, and he knew it. "You look beautiful," he said. And the terrible thing was that she believed he meant it. Even men who were lying about everything else sometimes told the truth about the small things. "Thank you," she said, ready for another evening of saving the world one charity donation at a time. He smiled his CEO smile, the one designed for rooms, not for her specifically. "Ready?" she said simply. The car ride to the Fairmont was 22 minutes. They sat beside each other in the back of the town car and made the kind of light, competent conversation that long-married people who no longer said anything real to each other had perfected to an art form. The gala, the guest list, the foundation that was being honored tonight. Daniel mentioned 2 board members he needed to connect with. Victoria mentioned a philanthropist she'd been corresponding with about a joint initiative. Professional, smooth, entirely hollow. She watched the city pass outside her window and thought about her brother Julian's call from 3 days ago. Julian, who was 3 years younger, and who had inherited their father's legal mind and their mother Eleanor's particular brand of devastating social intelligence. "We're ready," Julian had said without preamble, without even saying hello first. "Dad signed off. Everything is in position. We just need you to give us the signal." "Not yet," she'd told him. "V, not yet, Julian. I'll know when." A pause on his end. Then, "Okay, but just so you know, Marcus at Meridian Capital has already been briefed. The moment the word goes out, those credit lines are frozen within 48 hours. His entire operating structure depends on that line." "I know." "He doesn't know you know." "I know that too." Another pause. She could picture Julian on the other end in his office jacket off-tie, loosened, that sharp mind of his running through contingencies the way other people ran through grocery lists. "You're sure about this? You're sure you want to go that route?" Victoria had taken a breath, not a trembling breath, a measured one. "Julian." He brought her to a public gala, a charity event, with our names on the invitation. Julian was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll tell Dad." That conversation had been 72 hours ago, and now here she was, stepping out of the town car in front of the Fairmont Royal York, the city's most prestigious hotel, glittering like a promise above her. Daniel's hand hovering at the small of her back in that performance of a gesture that husbands made at public events, and Victoria was thinking quietly, clearly, with absolute certainty that tonight was the night. The ballroom of the Fairmont Royal York was everything it had always been, immense and golden and overwhelming in the particular way that rooms are when they are designed specifically to remind you of your own smallness unless you belong. 600 people. Round tables draped in ivory linen, centerpieces of white orchids and soft candlelight. A raised stage at the far end where the foundation's chairman would speak later in the evening. A full bar running the length of the west wall where the serious drinkers had already positioned themselves. Victoria and Daniel moved through the room with the ease of 2 people who had done this hundreds of times. Handshakes, smiles, brief, meaningful exchanges with people who mattered. The kind of social navigation that looked effortless and required enormous invisible skill. She was 47 years old, and she was the most composed person in the room. She knew it, and she allowed herself that knowledge not as vanity, but as preparation. They had been seated for perhaps 20 minutes, drinks in hand, conversation flowing with the couple to their left, a tech investor and his wife Victoria had known for years when the energy in the room changed. She didn't see Chloe Carter enter. She felt it, not in any mystical sense, but in the way you feel a shift in barometric pressure before a storm. Something in the room adjusted itself, a collective intake of breath, too subtle to name, a slight realignment of gazes across the ballroom that happens when someone enters who was not quite expected and is impossible to ignore. Victoria turned slowly, not quickly, not with alarm, not with, Chloe Carter was 29 years old, and she was wearing a dress the color of arterial blood, and she was walking across the marble floor of the Fairmont Royal York like she owned it, which Victoria understood in an instant was precisely the point. This was not an accident of scheduling. This was not a coincidence. This was a declaration. She was beautiful. Victoria allowed that assessment without malice or pain, the way you acknowledge a fact. Chloe Carter was beautiful, dark hair, sharp features, the kind of confidence that read as charisma from across a room. She had clearly spent a great deal of time and effort constructing exactly this entrance down to the precise angle of her chin. Daniel had gone still. Victoria felt it before she saw it, the sudden, absolute tension in his body beside her. His glass, which had been halfway to his mouth, stopped moving. She did not turn to look at him. She kept her eyes on Chloe, watched the younger woman's gaze find Daniel's across the room, watched the private language that passed between them in less than 3 seconds. Then Chloe began walking toward their table. The investor's wife beside Victoria had stopped talking mid-sentence. Someone at the next table had gone quiet. The invisible audience that exists at every social gathering of this kind, the people who are always watching, always cataloging, always storing information for later use, had snapped to attention. Chloe stopped in front of Victoria's table. She extended her hand across the white linen toward Victoria with a smile that was polished and confident, and Victoria observed this with clinical precision, just slightly too wide. The smile of someone who was performing certainty rather than genuinely feeling it. "Mrs. Hayes," she said. Her voice was warm, practiced. "I don't think we've been formally introduced. I'm Chloe Carter. I've been working very closely with Daniel on the Nexus expansion project." The table went very quiet. Victoria set down her wineglass with the particular deliberateness of a woman who was choosing every movement. She looked at Chloe Carter's extended hand. She looked at Chloe Carter's face. And then she took the hand, shook it once briefly, and released it with a composure so complete that several people watching would later describe it as almost frightening. "How interesting," Victoria said. "Daniel has never mentioned you." 5 words. Quiet, polite, delivered with the kind of absolute stillness that made them land like something physical. Chloe held her smile. "Well, I imagine Daniel has many things on his plate." She glanced at Daniel, then a quick proprietary glance that she did not fully bother to disguise. "We've been working practically around the clock." "I'm sure," Victoria said, and returned her attention to the investor's wife beside her, as though Chloe Carter had become less interesting than the table centerpiece. It was a dismissal so clean and so refined that it took Chloe a full 3 seconds to understand she had been dismissed. She recovered. Of course she did. She hadn't come here to be easily dismissed. She moved to a nearby table, accepted a drink from a passing server, and settled in with the practiced composure of someone who had decided in advance that this evening was hers. And then the evening began to move in the way evenings moved when something had been ignited that couldn't be put out again. Daniel excused himself from the table twice in 40 minutes. Both times he returned with that particular expression men wore when they thought they were hiding something slightly too relaxed, slightly too deliberately casual. The second time he returned, there was a microscopic adjustment in his jacket that told her he had been standing very close to someone. She said nothing. She smiled at the right moments. She responded to conversation. She lifted her wineglass. She was to all external appearances a woman having a pleasant evening at a charity gala. Inside, she was watching a clock that no one else could see. The investor's wife, her name was Margot, and she had been a close friend of Victoria's for 11 years, leaned over slightly under the pretense of reaching for the breadbasket. Her voice was barely above a murmur. "That woman is staring at Daniel as though she's already redecorating." Victoria reached for the breadbasket herself. "I noticed." V. Margot's voice had dropped even further, touched now with something that might have been alarm. "What's happening right now?" Victoria placed a piece of bread on her plate with the same precision she placed everything. "Nothing that isn't already finished," she said quietly. Margot pulled back slightly and looked at her, the way old friends did, when they were trying to read past the surface, when they needed to know whether to be worried or reassured. Whatever she saw on Victoria's face must have been reassuring in some particular way, because she nodded once slowly and returned her attention to her husband. Across the room, Chloe Carter was laughing at something head-tilted back voice, carrying just enough positioned at a careful angle to Daniel that was intimate without being technically inappropriate. Performing. All of it performing. And Daniel, God help him, was letting it happen, more than letting it participating, leaning slightly in her direction when their eyes met, allowing the conversation to drift toward her. He had stopped being careful. Victoria recognized this with a clarity that didn't surprise her, but that still carried its own particular weight. He had decided either consciously or in the slow, reckless way that people decided things, without admitting to themselves that they were deciding that tonight was the night he stopped pretending, that the performance of their marriage had become more than he was willing to sustain. She had been watching for this. This was the thing she had been waiting for, actually, not just the affair which she had known about for nearly 4 months, but this specific moment, the moment when Daniel stopped being careful and became reckless. Because recklessness had consequences. And consequences in her family's world were things that could be precisely engineered. The dinner service came and went. The foundation chairman gave a speech about impact and generosity that was professionally executed and almost entirely sincere. Various luminaries at various tables were acknowledged. A brief video played on the large screen at the front of the room, showing footage from the programs the foundation funded, children and after-school programs, small business owners who had received micro-grants, women in leadership retreats smiling into cameras with the particular expression of people who had been told their stories mattered. Victoria watched all of it. She applauded at the right moments. She made the kind of eye contact with the chairman when he swept his gaze across the room that indicated genuine engagement. She was present. She was composed. She was also waiting. At 9:47, Daniel Hayes stood up from his chair. He didn't signal that he was going to speak. He didn't tap his glass or ask for the microphone. He simply stood, and because he was Daniel Hayes, CEO of Hayes Dynamics, because his name was on the sponsorship board, and because he occupied the particular kind of space that certain successful men occupied in rooms like this one, people looked. Then they quieted. Then they waited. He cleared his throat. He smiled that charismatic self-made man smile that had carried him into a great many rooms he would not otherwise have been able to enter. "I just want to say something," he began, and his voice carried easily across the ballroom. "Tonight is about new beginnings, about having the courage to follow your heart, even when the path isn't perfectly clear." He paused. "Let that land. About being honest with yourself and with the world, about who you really are and what you really want." Another pause. His eyes moved briefly, just briefly, but undeniably, toward Chloe Carter's table. "I think that's a lesson we could all stand to embrace." The ballroom was quiet, not the engaged, appreciative quiet of an audience receiving a good speech. The other quiet, the held-breath quiet, of a room in which everyone has simultaneously understood something they weren't supposed to understand yet. Victoria did not move. She sat with her hands in her lap and her spine completely straight, and her expression, the expression of a woman waiting for a taxi patient, neutral, oriented toward a destination no one else could see. Daniel sat back down. He reached for his wine. His hand was almost steady. Victoria looked at him. He didn't quite meet her eyes. And then from across the ballroom, a chair scraped back. Chloe Carter stood up. She was holding her champagne glass. She was smiling. And in her eyes was something that Victoria recognized with the detached precision of someone who had spent her entire life reading rooms triumph. Premature, unearned, dangerously overconfident triumph. "I'd like to add something to that beautiful sentiment," Chloe said, her voice carrying the way she had clearly practiced it, to carry warm and bright and ringing across the candlelit tables. "To new beginnings." She raised her glass higher. "To the courage it takes to claim what you actually want. To Daniel." She let his name sit there in the middle of all that silence, like something placed very deliberately on a table for knowing his own heart. And then she turned. And she looked directly at Victoria Whitmore, and she smiled the smile of a woman who believed she had already won. "And to the future," Chloe finished, "wherever it leads." She drank. One person started to reach for their glass, then stopped, because no one else had moved. No applause, no echo of raised glasses, no validating murmur running through the crowd. 600 people in a golden ballroom, and the only sound was the ghost of Chloe Carter's voice fading into a silence that was in its totality one of the most complete and suffocating silences Victoria had ever witnessed. Margot beside Victoria had gone completely still. The investor across the table was looking at his plate. At the next table over, a woman Victoria didn't know had pressed her lips together in an expression that was both uncomfortable and riveted. Chloe's smile held for 4 full seconds. Then something crossed her face, not yet panic, not yet understanding, but a first faint tremor of doubt. The realization that the room had not responded the way she had expected it to respond. Victoria rose from her chair. Not dramatically, not quickly. She rose the way women rose in her family, with a kind of unhurried inevitability, the way tides rose because the motion was simply the next thing that was going to happen, and nothing in the world was going to alter that. She set her napkin on the table beside her plate. She smoothed the front of her gown, midnight blue silk, chosen 3 days ago for this specific evening, with a precision that had had nothing to do with fashion. And then she turned, and she began to walk toward the center of the ballroom. She was not walking away from Daniel. She was not walking toward Chloe. She was simply walking with the perfect, unhurried deliberateness of a woman who knew exactly what was about to happen because she had designed it herself. The room watched her. Every eye in the ballroom, including Chloe's, including Daniel's, including the eyes of people who had been paying attention to their dessert plates and their private conversations, followed her as she moved across the marble floor. And then from somewhere beyond the grand ballroom's double doors, Victoria Whitmore heard a sound she recognized before she heard it, the particular rhythm of footsteps, multiple and purposeful, moving in the measured way of people who had decided exactly where they were going and had no intention of being hurried. The doors opened. The first thing you noticed was the stillness. Not the stillness of uncertainty, the stillness of something enormous and inevitable, arriving at a destination it had always been moving toward. Augustus Whitmore walked into the ballroom of the Fairmont Royal York Hotel, and 600 people understood in an instant, with a collective wordless certainty, that the room they were in had just changed. He was 73 years old, and he walked like he was 45, and the suit he wore cost more than most people in the room made in a month, and he carried himself with the particular gravity of a man who had spent 5 decades being the most important person in every room he entered, and had simply never developed the habit of pretending otherwise. Behind him, Eleanor Whitmore, silver-haired, elegant, with a gaze that catalogued and dismissed in a single sweep, entered with the quiet authority of a woman who had been making powerful men uncomfortable at dinner parties for 30 years and considered it a minor hobby. And beside her, Julian Whitmore, 44 years old, legal mind like a surgical instrument face, carrying that signature Whitmore expression of absolute unhurried certainty, stepped into the light of the ballroom and let his eyes move once comprehensively across the room. Daniel Hayes saw them and went the color of old chalk. Victoria, standing in the center of the ballroom, did not turn around. She didn't need to. She could see it in Daniel's face the exact moment when the full weight of what he had done and what he hadn't understood about the woman he had done it to came crashing down on him with the quiet, merciless force of something inevitable. He had thought he was leaving a wife. He had not understood that he was picking a fight with a dynasty. And dynasties in Victoria. Whitmore's family did not lose fights. They didn't have to. They simply arrived and the fight was already over. Augustus Whitmore moved through the parting crowd toward his daughter, and the room made way for him, the way water made way for stone, not because it was forced to, but because the physics of the situation left no other option. He reached Victoria. He took her hand in both of his briefly and looked at her face with the careful attention of a father reading his child's expression for things she would never say aloud. "We're here," he said quietly. "I know," she said, "right on time." Augustus Whitmore did not raise his voice. He never had to. That was the thing about men like him. The kind of authority he carried didn't need volume. It needed presence. And in that ballroom, standing 6 feet from his daughter, with 600 people watching in absolute silence, his presence was the loudest thing in the room. He looked at Daniel Hayes the way a man looked at something he had already decided to remove from a situation, not with anger, not with contempt exactly, but with the particular detached assessment of someone evaluating a problem that was already solved. Daniel, for his part, had not moved from his chair. He was sitting there with his wine glass still in his hand and his face the color of old plaster. And he looked, Victoria thought, exactly like what he was, a man who had made a very large mistake and was only now understanding the full dimensions of it. Chloe Carter was still standing. That was the thing that struck several people watching afterward, when they replayed the evening in their minds, that Chloe didn't sit down immediately. She held her position for a full, agonizing 10 seconds after the Whitmore family entered the ballroom, her champagne glass still raised at a slightly lower angle. Now her smile still technically present, but beginning to show the first hairline fractures of something she wasn't equipped to name yet. She was looking at Augustus, then at Eleanor, then at Julian, running some kind of rapid internal calculation, trying to place these people, trying to understand why the room had responded to their entrance the way it had. She didn't have enough information. That was her problem. She had done her research on Victoria Whitmore, the wife, the charity boards, the social calendar, the 12-year marriage to Daniel Hayes, the graceful, composed public presence. She had not done her research on Victoria Whitmore, the daughter, on what it meant in the specific financial and social architecture of this city to be the eldest child of Augustus Whitmore of Whitmore Capital. She was about to find out. Julian moved first. He had that quality Victoria's brother, the ability to cross a room without seeming to hurry and arrive somewhere with the feeling that he had always been there, that the room had arranged itself around him rather than the other way around. He walked to within 8 feet of Daniel's table, stopped, and clasped his hands in front of him with the easy composure of a man who argued in front of federal judges 3 times a month and had long since stopped finding any room particularly intimidating. He looked at Daniel. Daniel looked back at him. "Julian," Daniel said. His voice was careful, not panicked yet. Daniel was too controlled for immediate panic, but careful in the way that voices got careful when their owners were running very fast, internal calculations, and needed time they were not being given. "Daniel," Julian's voice was pleasant, professionally, surgically pleasant. "I hope the evening has been enjoyable so far." Something about the way he said it made the woman at the nearest table set down her fork. Daniel's jaw tightened by a fraction. "What are you doing here?" "My sister's name is on the invitation," Julian said simply. "As is yours. We're here to support the foundation." He let a half-second of silence land. "And to support Victoria, of course, as we always do." That last sentence was not a statement. Everyone in earshot understood that it was not a statement. It was a perimeter being drawn quietly and precisely around a woman who some people in this room had apparently underestimated, in full view of everyone who would ever matter to them, professionally or socially. Daniel set his wine glass down. "Julian, this isn't the place." "I agree entirely," Julian said, "which is why I'm going to suggest we take care of certain matters quietly and quickly so that the Foundation's evening can proceed without further interruption." He glanced once, just once, toward Chloe Carter, who was finally sitting back down her champagne glass, lowering to the table in front of her with a small click that sounded in the surrounding silence much louder than it was. Then Julian looked back at Daniel. "My father would like a word." It wasn't a request. The grammar of it might have been a request, but the meaning was not. Everyone understood that the meaning was not. Augustus Whitmore moved to stand beside his son. He was unhurried. He had been unhurried his entire life. Men who built the kind of thing he had built learned early that urgency was a signal of weakness, that real power moved at its own pace, because it could afford to, because time itself tended to cooperate with it. He looked at Daniel Hayes, and Daniel looked back at him, and for a moment the entire ballroom existed only in the space between those two men. "Daniel," Augustus said. "Just the name. Nothing attached to it. Just the name and the voice of a man who had once personally approved the first significant line of credit that had made Hayes Dynamics possible 12 years ago as a wedding gift to his daughter and her ambitious new husband." Daniel's throat moved. "Sir, I think," Augustus said, "that you and I have some things to discuss. Not tonight. Tonight is for the Foundation." He let his eyes move briefly, comprehensively across the table, across Chloe's empty seat, across the disrupted evening, across everything that had happened in the last 20 minutes, and then he looked back at Daniel with an expression that was almost kind in the way that a final diagnosis delivered by a precise doctor was almost kind. But soon, he stepped back, and that was it. That was all. No raised voices, No accusations, no dramatic confrontation. And somehow it was the most devastating thing that had happened in that ballroom all evening. At the table, 3 rows to the left, a hedge fund manager named Richard Pratt, who had done business with Hayes Dynamics for 7 years and who had been watching the entire sequence of events with the riveted attention of a man watching a market move, leaned over to his wife and murmured 3 words, "Call Marcus tomorrow." His wife knew what that meant. His wife had been married to a man in finance for 31 years. She nodded without looking at him. At another table, a woman who sat on 2 of the same foundation boards as Victoria quietly pulled out her phone and sent a text message to a colleague that read simply, "Did you see that?" The reply came back in under 30 seconds. "I saw it." These were the small, invisible movements that would begin to gather and accelerate in the days to come. But right now in the ballroom, the immediate drama was still unfolding, and it was unfolding in the direction of Chloe Carter. Eleanor Whitmore had not spoken yet. She had entered the room, positioned herself, and observed with the unruffled patience of a woman who had spent 50 years watching rooms and knew exactly when to move and when to wait. Now she moved. She walked unhurried past her husband and her son, past Daniel's table, and stopped at the table where Chloe Carter sat. Chloe looked up. In her eyes, Victoria could see, even from where she was standing, the specific expression of someone who understood finally that something had gone badly, badly wrong with an evening they had very carefully planned, but who had not yet fully mapped the extent of the damage. Eleanor looked at Chloe the way she looked at everything completely without flinching and without particular malice. Just clarity. Just the clear-eyed assessment of a woman who had known exactly who she was for so long that she no longer required the validation of anyone else's opinion. "I don't believe we've met," Eleanor said. Her voice was even. It carried. Chloe opened her mouth. I know who you are," Eleanor said, and the mild, quiet certainty of it stopped Chloe mid-sentence, the way a hand raised in a crosswalk stopped traffic. "I also know what you thought you were doing tonight." A pause. Not a long one. Not a theatrical one. Just long enough. "You mistook borrowed attention for power, my dear. It's a common error, but the consequences of it—" Eleanor let her gaze move briefly to the room around them, to the 600 people who were observing with the intensity of people watching something they would be describing to others for years, are rarely comfortable. She turned away from Chloe with the same unhurried ease with which she had turned toward her and walked back to her husband's side. And that was the entirety of Eleanor Whitmore's engagement with the woman who had stood up in a ballroom and toasted the destruction of her daughter's marriage. It was, several people would say later, the most effective thing anyone had said all evening, including the foundation chairman's professionally written speech. Chloe Carter sat very still at her table. The woman beside her, a colleague from Hayes Dynamics who had come tonight as part of the corporate block and who was deeply, visibly regretting it had moved her chair approximately 4 inches to the left, a tiny but unmistakable act of social distance. Chloe reached for her champagne glass. It was empty. She set it back down. Daniel had not looked at her since the Whitmore family entered the room. He was looking at Augustus, then at Julian, then at his own hands. He was performing some kind of internal triage. Victoria could see it, the rapid, urgent assessment of a man trying to understand how much damage had been done and whether any of it was reversible. His expression was the expression of someone arriving at answers they did not want. Victoria watched him from where she stood in the center of the room. She watched the understanding move across his face in real time, like watching weather change over water. She watched him understand about the credit lines, or begin to understand because he didn't know the specifics yet, didn't know about Marcus at Meridian Capital, or what Julian's 3 days of preparation had produced, but he was smart enough to feel the shape of it, to understand that the financial architecture of his company was suddenly fundamentally less secure than it had been 2 hours ago. She watched him understand about the investors, about the board members sitting at various tables in this very room who had just watched Augustus Whitmore enter a gala and make a point of standing near Daniel Hayes without extending any warmth toward him. In a world where relationships were currency, the Whitmore family had just publicly withdrawn their investment, and every sophisticated person in the room had clocked it and filed it for immediate use. She watched Daniel Hayes understand in real time that he had confused the wife with the power, that he had looked at Victoria for 12 years and seen a woman composed, elegant, present, and had not seen the dynasty behind her because the dynasty had not needed to make itself visible until now. Margot appeared at Victoria's side. She didn't say anything immediately. She simply stood there for a moment, the way close friends did when they understood that the moment didn't require words yet. Then quietly, "Are you all right?" Victoria considered the question with genuine attention, the way she considered everything. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was Margot, "It's strange. I thought I would feel more." "What do you feel?" Victoria looked at Daniel across the room. He was looking back at her now, finally actually looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face in years. Not love, not guilt exactly. Something more complicated than either. The look of a man seeing something clearly that he had been choosing not to see for a long time, and finding that the clarity arriving this late and under these circumstances provided no relief whatsoever. "Finished," she said simply. "I feel finished." Margot absorbed this. Then she took Victoria's arm lightly, the way women who had been friends for over a decade took each other's arms. "Then let's go be finished somewhere with better dessert." Victoria almost smiled. Almost. "Give me a moment." She walked to her father. Augustus saw her coming and turned fully toward her, giving her his complete attention in the way he always had, not the divided attention of a busy man making space, but the whole focused, unhurried attention that had always made Victoria feel since childhood that she was the most important thing in whatever room they shared. "Thank you for coming," she said. "We were always going to come," he said. "You know that." "I know." She looked at him. He looked at her. There was a full conversation happening in that silence that no one else in the room had access to about choices and timing and the particular kind of courage it took to wait until you were certain rather than moving when the pain was freshest. "I wanted to wait until he made it public." Augustus nodded. "You were right to wait. Julian has everything in place. Everything." A pause. "The Meridian line freezes at 9 tomorrow morning, unless Marcus hears from me to the contrary." His eyes moved briefly to Daniel across the room. "He will not hear from me to the contrary." Victoria took a breath. "Okay. The board review trigger activates Wednesday. The contract clauses Julian flagged." Augustus stopped himself, looked at his daughter's face. "We can go through the specifics tomorrow. Tonight is done." "Tonight is done," she agreed. She turned back once to look at the room. At Daniel sitting at the table that still had her place setting across from his, staring at a half-full wine glass, as though it contained information he needed. At Chloe Carter, who had stopped performing entirely now, who was sitting in her red dress with her arms close to her body and her face arranged in the careful blankness of someone trying very hard not to look like they were calculating an exit. At the room full of people who would take what they had witnessed tonight and carry it out into the world of meetings and calls and quiet conversations that constituted the real architecture of power in a city like this one. She looked at all of it. She let herself feel it, not with triumph, not with grief, but with the particular clarity that came after a long and difficult decision had finally been made and enacted and could not be unmade. Then she turned away. She walked toward her family, her father and her mother and her brother, who were already moving toward the exit, with the unhurried certainty of people who had done what they came to do, and she did not look back again. Behind her, she heard a chair scrape. She heard Daniel's voice say her name, Victoria, in a tone she hadn't heard him use since the early years of their marriage, when things were real between them. Low, uncertain, almost young. She kept walking. She heard it again. "Victoria, please." She did not stop, not because she was punishing him, not because she was performing an exit, but because there was genuinely nothing left to say, and she had understood that for a long time before tonight, and tonight had simply made it official. Julian held the door for her. As she passed him, he said nothing. He simply looked at her with the expression that meant he was proud of her, and that they would talk tomorrow, and that everything was already moving. She stepped out of the ballroom. The noise of the room, the hum of conversation reasserting itself, now that the main drama had concluded the clink of glasses, the tentative resumption of a normal evening that could not quite manage to feel normal, faded behind the closing door. Eleanor fell into step beside her daughter as they moved through the corridor. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Their heels made quiet sounds on the floor. Somewhere behind them, they could hear Augustus and Julian talking in the low, efficient shorthand of men who had already moved into the operational phase of something. "How long did you know?" Eleanor asked finally. 4 months, Victoria said. Eleanor absorbed this. "You said nothing." "I was waiting." "For what specifically?" Victoria thought about it. About the night she'd first noticed the phone going face down. About the 112 mornings she had made coffee and watched Daniel move through their kitchen with the particular distraction of a man carrying a secret he was growing less careful about. About the call with Julian, about the guest list for tonight's gala with Chloe Carter's name on the Hayes Dynamics corporate block. "I was waiting for him to make a choice," she said. "A real one, out loud, in front of people who mattered." She paused. "So there would be no ambiguity. Not for him, not for me, not for anyone." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then, with the precise, understated delivery that was her signature, "He certainly managed that." And Victoria in the corridor outside the ballroom of the Fairmont Royal York, away from the 600 people and the orchids and the candlelight and the wreckage of an evening that had played out exactly as she had known it would, laughed. Briefly and genuinely, the way she hadn't laughed in a very long time. Eleanor took her arm. They walked. Back inside the ballroom, Daniel Hayes sat at a table that felt very large and very empty. His phone was in his hand. He was looking at it without seeing it. Around him, the evening carried on conversation dessert service, the quiet professional movements of the waitstaff with the determined normalcy of a social world that had witnessed something significant and was now collectively processing it. At her table, Chloe Carter straightened her spine. She reached for a glass of water since the champagne was gone. She arranged her expression into something that was meant to communicate that she was completely fine, entirely unbothered, and in full command of herself and the situation. The woman beside her, the Hayes Dynamics colleague, who had been gradually migrating her chair to the left all evening, excused herself to visit the restroom. She did not come back. Chloe sat alone in her red dress in a room full of people and looked at the ballroom doors that the Whitmore family had walked through, and for the first time since she had entered this room tonight, in the carefully calculated confidence of a woman who believed she was winning, she allowed herself to feel the first cold edge of what was actually happening. She had not won tonight. She had not even competed in the game she thought she was playing. She had walked into a situation she had fundamentally misread, and she had made herself the most visible person in the room at exactly the wrong moment, and 600 people had watched her do it. Her champagne toast echoed in her own memory, the raised glass, the smile, the confident, to the future wherever it leads, and now in the silence of understanding what she had actually done, it felt less like a triumph, and more like a declaration she would spend a very long time trying to outlive. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Royal York continued its evening. The foundation's work went on. The conversations continued. The dessert plates were cleared. The orchestra in the corner played something gentle and complicated. And in the middle of all of it, a story that had been building for 112 days reached its first ending. Not a loud one, not a dramatic one, not the kind that looked from the outside like a victory celebration. Just a door swinging closed. A woman walking out of a room she had once belonged to, into the open air of a life she was about to rebuild entirely on her own terms. The kind of ending that was also unmistakably the beginning of something else. The morning after the gala, Daniel Hayes woke up alone, not in the sense that Chloe wasn't there, she wasn't. But that wasn't what he meant when the word alone hit him at 6:47 in the morning with the particular weight of something irreversible. He woke up alone in the way that a man woke up alone when he understood, without anyone having to say it, that the life he had been living for 12 years had ended the previous evening, and he had been the one who ended it. He lay there for 3 minutes without moving. Then he reached for his phone. 17 missed calls, 4 from board members, 2 from his CFO, Marcus No Wait, not his CFO, Marcus at Meridian Capital. The name hit him like cold water. He sat up. He called Marcus back. Marcus picked up on the second ring. His voice was professional and careful in the way that voices got when they were delivering information the speaker did not enjoy delivering. "Daniel, I've been trying to reach you. I see that. What's happening? A pause. Not a long one. Long enough. I received a communication this morning regarding the Whitmore Capital position on your credit facility. Another pause. The line has been frozen, Daniel, effective 9 a.m. today. Daniel's hand tightened on the phone. Frozen. Pending a full review. I want to be honest with you. I'm not in a position to say when or whether. Who authorized this? Marcus's pause this time was different, more careful. The instruction came directly from Augustus Whitmore's office. Daniel got out of bed. He walked to the window. The city was already moving below him, entirely indifferent to the fact that his operating structure had just lost one of its 3 primary supports at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday. How much runway do we have without the Meridian line at current burn rate? Marcus hesitated. 11 weeks, maybe 12 if we defer the Vancouver expansion. 11 weeks. Daniel stood at his window and looked at the city and thought about 11 weeks and what 11 weeks meant when you were trying to hold together a company whose foundation had just become overnight a great deal less stable than it had appeared. He called Julian Whitmore. Julian picked up immediately, which was somehow worse than if he hadn't picked up at all. Daniel, you froze my credit line. My father froze your credit line, Julian said with the precise accuracy of a man who did not make errors of attribution. That's an important distinction. Julian. Daniel's voice was controlled. He was working very hard to keep it controlled. Whatever happened last night, whatever you all think happened, this is not the way to handle it. This affects 300 employees, people's jobs, people's... Daniel. Julian's voice didn't change. It stayed exactly as pleasant and exactly as immovable as it had been in the ballroom the previous evening. I'm going to stop you right there because I want to be very clear about something. The Meridian Credit Facility was always contingent on Whitmore Capital's continued participation in your investor structure. That's in the original agreement. You signed that agreement. I drafted it. A pause. This isn't a reaction to last night. This is a contractual consequence of a decision you made when you decided to restructure your priorities. The word priorities landed with the precision of something thrown very accurately. Daniel said nothing for a moment. Then, I need to speak to Victoria. Victoria will speak to you through our family's legal representation, Julian said. As of this morning, I am that representation. You're welcome to call my office and schedule... Daniel hung up. He stood in the middle of his bedroom with his phone in his hand, and his heart hammering, and his mind running through numbers, through timelines, through the interlocking dependencies of a company he had spent 15 years building, and he tried to find the angle, the move, the counter, the thing a smart man did when a situation like this one arrived. He couldn't find it. For the first time in 15 years, he genuinely couldn't find it. Because the thing about the Whitmore family's financial architecture, and this was the thing Daniel had understood intellectually for years, but had never truly felt in his body until this morning, was that it wasn't just money. It was relationships. It was the network of trust and credibility and professional association that Augustus Whitmore had spent 50 years building, and into which Daniel Hayes had been absorbed when he married Victoria, and from which he was now quite systematically being removed. His CFO called at 9:15, then his head of investor relations at 9:32. Then at 9:47, Richard Pratt, the hedge fund manager from the gala, the man who had watched Augustus Whitmore enter the ballroom and called his wife a word called, and left a voicemail that was professionally worded and deeply unmistakably clear in its meaning. Pratt Capital was requesting a review of its Hayes Dynamics position. They would be in touch. Daniel listened to the voicemail twice. Then he sat down on the edge of his bed. This man who had stood up in a ballroom the previous evening and given a speech about courage and new beginnings and put his face in his hands. Across the city in this Whitmore family's principal residence, Victoria was having breakfast with her parents and her brother at 8 in the morning. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that families who had been through significant things together knew how to maintain, not the uncomfortable quiet of people who didn't know what to say, but the settled quiet of people who had said what needed to be said and were now simply being together. Eleanor had made coffee. Augustus was reading something on his tablet with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. Julian had his laptop open and was moving through emails with the focused efficiency of a man for whom 9 a.m. on a Tuesday was a deeply operational hour. Victoria was eating toast and looking out the window at the city thinking. She had slept, which surprised her slightly. She had expected to lie awake with the particular restless energy of aftermath, the way you sometimes couldn't sleep after a significant thing, when your mind kept returning to the evening and replaying it, looking for the moments you might have handled differently. But she had slept. Solidly. In the way of someone whose body understood that a long tension had finally released. Julian looked up from his laptop. Meridian confirmed. 9 a.m. exactly as planned. Augustus nodded without looking up from his tablet. Victoria wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. And the board review? Wednesday. I've already contacted 3 of the 5 independent board members directly. Julian's eyes moved back to his screen. Let's just say the gala made certain conversations significantly easier to have. Meaning that when a CEO gives an unscripted public speech at a charity event about following his heart and new beginnings. Julian paused to click something. The board members of his company tend to have some questions about his judgment, professionally speaking. Victoria absorbed this. And the Vancouver expansion. Frozen pending the credit review, which means his Q3 projections are no longer realistic, which means his conversations with the 2 institutional investors he's been courting. Julian made a small, precise gesture with one hand that communicated the conclusion without requiring the sentence to be finished. Augustus finally looked up from his tablet. He looked at his daughter with the careful, unhurried attention he always gave her. How are you feeling this morning? The question was so direct and so genuine that it cut through everything else through the legal mechanics and the financial timelines and the operational specifics and landed somewhere much simpler. Victoria looked at her father. I feel like someone who's been holding their breath for 4 months, she said, and finally exhaled. Augustus nodded. He looked at her for another moment. Then he went back to his tablet, which was coming from him as close to "I'm proud of you" as the man typically got in spoken form. Eleanor, who was refilling her coffee, said without turning around, "The foundation called this morning. They want to know if last night's events require any kind of statement." "No," Victoria said immediately. "That's what I told them." Eleanor brought her coffee back to the table. "I also told them that the Whitmore Foundation's donation this year would be increasing by 30% and that Victoria would be joining their leadership committee." She sat down. That seemed to satisfy any remaining concerns. Victoria looked at her mother. "You did that without asking me." Eleanor met her daughter's eyes with the serene certainty of a woman who had spent 50 years being right about the important things. "Did I need to ask?" Victoria held her gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee. "No," she said, "you didn't." At 10:15 that morning, Chloe Carter arrived at the Hayes Dynamics offices on the 34th floor of a downtown tower and found that her keycard no longer worked. She stood at the glass security door for a full 15 seconds, pressing it twice, then a third time before the reality of what was happening became undeniable. She turned to the security desk. The guard on duty, a man named Frank, who had worked the building for 6 years and who had always been perfectly pleasant to her, looked at her with an expression of genuine discomfort. "Miss Carter, I was told to let you know that HR would like to speak with you. They asked that you wait in the lobby." "My keycard isn't working," she said. Her voice was steady. She was holding her voice very steady. "Yes, ma'am. If you'd like to wait." "Frank?" She took a breath. "Can you just call upstairs and let them know I'm here? There's clearly some kind of system error with my Miss Carter." His voice was kind, but immovable. "HR has asked you to wait in the lobby. I'd recommend waiting in the lobby." She waited in the lobby for 22 minutes. The HR director, a woman named Sandra, who Chloe had always found efficient and forgettable, came down in the elevator with a manila envelope and the expression of someone who had done this before and found it uncomfortable every time. "Chloe," Sandra said, "thank you for coming in." "My keycard doesn't work," Chloe said again, because somehow this felt like the most manageable piece of what was happening. "I know, I'm sorry." Sandra extended the envelope. This outlines your severance package and the terms of your separation. We've been generous, given the circumstances more generous than was strictly required. Chloe looked at the envelope. She did not take it immediately. Given what circumstances? Sandra pressed her lips together briefly. Chloe, I think you know. I want to hear you say it. Sandra held her gaze. Your conduct last night at the Foundation Gala was considered a significant breach of professional standards. Beyond that, she paused, there have been concerns raised at the board level about certain conduct over the past several months. Combine these circumstances. Concerns raised by whom? Chloe's voice was sharper now. The control was beginning to cost her more than she had. By Victoria Whitmore, because she has her family come in and throw their weight around and suddenly everyone's... Chloe! Sandra's voice didn't rise, didn't harden. It just became very, very clear. The concerns were raised by multiple members of the board. This decision was made at that level. I'm simply here to facilitate the process as professionally as possible. She extended the envelope again. Please take this. Read it carefully. And if you have questions, you can contact our legal department directly. Chloe took the envelope. Her hand was steady. Her face was steady. Everything about her external presentation was steady, in the way that things were steady right before they weren't. She walked out of the Hayes Dynamics lobby into the sharp morning air and stood on the sidewalk with a manila envelope in her hand and the city moving around her in every direction, and she thought about last night, about the red dress, about the raised champagne glass, about the moment when she had looked straight at Victoria Whitmore and said to the future, wherever it leads. The future had arrived considerably faster than she had anticipated. She thought about calling Daniel. She had not spoken to him since the gala. He had not called, had not texted, and she had told herself last night, lying awake in her apartment, replaying the evening in brutal detail, that he was probably managing the fallout, that he would call in the morning, that whatever the complications were, they were temporary complications in the trajectory of something that was fundamentally real. She called him. It went to voicemail after 4 rings. She didn't leave a message. She called again 20 minutes later, standing at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the building she could no longer enter. This time, it went to voicemail after 2 rings, which meant he had seen her name and declined it. She put her phone in her bag. She ordered a coffee she didn't drink. And she sat with the specific, clarifying silence of a woman who was beginning to understand, in concrete and unavoidable terms, what had actually happened in that ballroom and what it meant for every part of her life that had been without her fully realizing it, contingent on a situation she had fundamentally misread. Daniel Hayes, meanwhile, was on his 4th call of the morning when his assistant knocked on his office door and entered without waiting, which told him immediately that whatever she was about to say required the kind of urgency that overrode normal protocol. "You need to see this," she said, and held out her phone. On the screen was a social media post from an account associated with one of the city's more influential society bloggers, the kind of person who attended the right events and had the right contacts and had spent years cultivating an audience that was in the specific way of their world. Exactly the audience whose opinion shaped professional reputations in tangible ways. The post had gone up at 9 a.m. It had been shared 214 times by 10:15. It described in the specific and carefully sourced way of someone who had been in the room the events of the previous evening. The unscripted speech, the champagne toast, the arrival of the Whitmore family. It used phrases like stunning public confrontation and the quiet power of old money and what Hayes Dynamics executives might want to know about their CEO's priorities. It was by any measure exceptionally damaging, and it had been shared 214 times in 75 minutes. Daniel handed the phone back to his assistant. "Get me our PR firm." "They've already called," she said. "Twice. They say..." She glanced down at her own phone. "They say they need to speak with you urgently about the narrative." The narrative. He almost laughed. There was no narrative. There was just what had happened in front of 600 people, and what was continuing to happen in the form of frozen credit lines and board-level concerns, and a social media post being shared 214 times and counting. He picked up his desk phone and called Victoria directly. It rang 5 times. Then her voicemail. Her voice on the recording was exactly as composed and precise as it always was, warm but bounded, professional but personal. the voice of a woman who managed impressions with absolute control, even on an automated recording. "Victoria," he said. He stopped. "Try it again. I know you have your family involved now, and I know what that means, and I'm not calling about Hayes Dynamics. I'm calling because..." He stopped again. The sentence had several possible endings, and none of them were adequate. "I'd like to talk, that's all. Just talk, please." He hung up. He sat at his desk. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, the city performed its indifferent Tuesday morning, and Daniel Hayes sat inside the empire he had spent 15 years building, and felt for the first time that the walls of it were made of something considerably less solid than he had believed. Victoria listened to the voicemail at 11:45, standing in the hallway of her parents' home, with her coat on, ready to leave for a lunch meeting she had scheduled 3 days ago, with a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, a venture philanthropist she had been corresponding with about a joint initiative in women's leadership development. The meeting had nothing to do with Daniel or the gala or last night. It was simply the next thing on her calendar, the first appointment of the life she was already rebuilding. She listened to Daniel's voicemail once, standing very still in the hallway, with the familiar voice filling her ear, uncertain now, stripped of its usual confident performance, genuinely uncertain in a way she hadn't heard from him in years. She felt the ache of it. She allowed herself to feel it briefly and fully, the way she allowed herself to feel most things, with complete attention and without drama. Then she put her phone in her bag and opened the front door. Priya was waiting with the car. "Lunch with Dr. Chen," Priya confirmed, consulting her tablet. "She's already there, and you have a call with the foundation board at 2:30. "Perfect," Victoria said. She got into the car. As they pulled into traffic, her phone buzzed with a text from Julian board meeting called for Thursday. 2 members have already indicated they'll be requesting Daniel's explanation on the Q3 restructure. It's moving faster than projected. "Call me tonight." She read it. She typed back, "Okay." Then she put the phone away and looked out the window at the city and thought about Dr. Chen and the initiative they were building and what it could become with the right resources and the right commitment behind it. She thought about what she had said to her father last night in the ballroom when he had arrived and taken her hand. I wanted to wait until he made it public, so there would be no ambiguity. There was no ambiguity now. The car moved through the city, and Victoria Whitmore moved through it with the focused, forward-facing energy of a woman who had closed one chapter so completely and so finally that she could already feel the next one beginning to take shape. Not with triumph, not with grief, with the particular quiet clarity of someone who had done a hard thing correctly and was now ready for what came after. At the Hayes Dynamics offices, Daniel's assistant knocked on his door again at 12:30. Her expression had moved past uncomfortable and arrived somewhere in the vicinity of genuinely alarmed. "The 2 institutional investors he had the calls with last week," she said quietly, as though saying it at a lower volume would make it less significant. "Both of them have requested to postpone their meetings, indefinitely." Daniel looked at her from across his desk. He said nothing for a moment. "Indefinitely," he repeated. "That's what their offices said." He nodded once. He picked up his pen and set it back down. He looked at the city through his window. And then, in the privacy of his own office, with only his assistant as witness, Daniel Hayes allowed the composed, controlled exterior of the self-made CEO to crack just slightly, just for a moment, a tightening around his eyes, a long, slow exhale that carried with it the weight of everything that had been, until approximately 14 hours ago, the architecture of a life. "Clear my afternoon," he said. She nodded and left. The door closed quietly behind her, and in the silence of his office, among the awards and the custom furniture and the framed magazine profiles of a man at the height of his success, Daniel Hayes sat alone with what he had done and what it had cost, and what, if anything, could be salvaged from the wreckage of an evening he had walked into, convinced he was winning. 2 floors below, in the building's lobby, a woman in a red dress had already walked out the door. She was not coming back. The Thursday board meeting of Hayes Dynamics began at 9 in the morning and was by any professional measure the most uncomfortable 2 hours Daniel Hayes had experienced in 15 years of running a company. He had prepared. Of course he had prepared, Daniel. Hayes did not walk into rooms unprepared, had never in his professional life allowed himself the vulnerability of entering a high-stakes situation without a strategy in hand. He had spent Wednesday night at his desk going through numbers, through projections, through the specific contractual language Julian had apparently been threading through his company's legal structure for years, like a slow, patient wire. He had called his own legal team. He had called his PR firm. He had constructed what he believed was a defensible narrative: temporary liquidity, adjustment, strategic restructuring, market conditions, requiring flexible positioning. And he had walked into that boardroom at 9 a.m. on Thursday with his jacket pressed and his voice controlled and his face arranged in the expression of a man who had everything managed. The board was not interested in the narrative. There were 5 independent board members. 2 of them, he had been told by Julian's voicemail, were already asking questions. By the time he arrived Thursday morning, it was not 2, it was 4. The one who spoke first was a woman named Patricia Osei, 61 years old. Former CFO of a major financial institution, board member for 3 years, someone Daniel had always considered reliably in his corner. She was the one who had championed his last expansion proposal. She was the one who had personally called 2 institutional investors on his behalf 18 months ago. She was the one who looked at him across the board table at 9:07 and said without preamble, "Daniel, I'm going to ask you directly, and I need a direct answer. What is the current status of the Whitmore Capital participation in our credit structure?" The room was very quiet. Daniel looked at Patricia. He thought about the answer he had prepared. Then he thought about the fact that Patricia Osei had spent 40 years in rooms exactly like this one and could identify a managed answer from across a continent. He put the prepared answer down. "The Whitmore line has been frozen," he said, "as of Tuesday morning." The silence that followed was the kind that boards produced when they received information they had already suspected but needed to hear confirmed before they could act on it. "Frozen by whom?" Patricia asked. "Augustus Whitmore. Directly." "On what grounds?" Daniel looked at her. "Personal grounds." The board member to Patricia's left, a man named Howard Chen, who had been on the board for 7 years and who had always been pleasant in the particular way of men who were pleasant right up until they weren't, said quietly, "Personal grounds," meaning the events at the Foundation Gala Tuesday evening. It was not technically a question. "I'd prefer to keep personal matters separate from—" "Daniel," Patricia's voice was not unkind. It was simply immovable. "What happened at that gala is already on social media. It has been shared extensively. Several of us received calls from investors Wednesday morning referencing it specifically. The separation between personal and professional that you're asking us to maintain," she paused, "is not a separation that the market is making." He had no answer to that. For the first time in the meeting, he had no answer. Patricia looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a woman who had genuinely respected him, who had gone to bat for him, who was now sitting with the specific disappointment of someone who had invested belief in a person and was watching that investment fail. "I think," she said carefully, "that we need to discuss a formal performance review, and I think we need to discuss it today." That was the moment Daniel Hayes understood, not intellectually, not analytically, but in the full-body way that real understanding arrived, that his company was not going to survive this intact, not in its current form, not with him at the helm, not with the Whitmore financial architecture removed and the board's confidence shaken and the institutional investors postponing indefinitely, and the social media coverage circulating through exactly the professional circles that his company's reputation depended on. The empire was not going to fall today. It was going to fall slowly in the way that large things fell piece by piece, foundation by foundation, the way a building looked intact from the outside until the moment it didn't. He sat through the rest of the board meeting with the controlled composure of a man who had trained himself over 15 years never to show weakness in a room. It cost him more than anything he had ever done. And when it was over, when he walked out of the boardroom and down the corridor to his office and closed the door behind him, he stood with his back against the door and allowed himself in the privacy of that room to feel the full weight of what was happening. 3 hours later, at 12:45, his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Victoria. He picked up before the second ring. Victoria. A brief silence on her end. Then, I got your voicemail. Her voice was exactly what it always was, composed warm at its edges, completely controlled. I thought I should call rather than respond through Julian. Thank you. He moved to his chair, sat down. Thank you for calling directly. What did you want to say, Daniel? He had thought about this call, had rehearsed versions of it in his mind since Tuesday night, had constructed various approaches, the apologetic one, the practical one, the one that opened with acknowledgement, and moved toward negotiation. Now that she was on the line, none of them felt usable. They all felt like what they were performances, and he was exhausted suddenly and completely by performance. I made a mistake, he said. Multiple mistakes, over a long period of time. He stopped. I know that's not enough. I know there's nothing I can say that... Daniel, her voice was quiet. I know. I know about the board meeting. He paused. Of course you do. Julian keeps me informed. He exhaled slowly. Is there any version of this, any version at all, where we could talk not through lawyers, not through your family, just us, a silence? Long enough that he thought she was going to decline and end the call, and that would be the end of it. Then she said, Saturday morning, the Hazel Room, 10 o'clock, 1 hour. His heart did something complicated. Okay. 1 hour, Daniel. And I want you to understand before you come, I'm not coming to negotiate the marriage. That's finished. I'm coming because we were together for 12 years, and you deserved one real conversation. He held the phone very carefully. I understand. Saturday, she said, and she was gone. He sat for a long moment with the dead phone in his hand. Then he set it on his desk and looked at the city through his window and thought about Saturday and what one real conversation meant when the marriage was already finished and the empire was already cracking, and the only thing left was to understand clearly and finally how something that had started as genuinely as theirs had arrived at a charity ballroom on a Tuesday evening with champagne glasses raised and everything broken. Across the city, Victoria put her phone down on Dr. Chen's conference table. They were in the middle of their second meeting in 3 days, the initiative taking shape with a speed and energy that felt to Victoria like the specific momentum of something that had been waiting to happen, and looked at the ceiling for exactly 3 seconds. Dr. Sarah Chen, who was 53 and sharp, and who had learned to read rooms the way Victoria had said simply, "Everything okay?" Yes, Victoria said. And then, because it was true, I'm having coffee with my husband Saturday morning. Ex-husband, shortly to be. Sarah absorbed this. Do you need to reschedule? No. Victoria looked back at the papers between them, the framework documents, the funding projections, the initial list of program targets. No, this is more important. She picked up her pen. Where were we? Sarah looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman who recognized another woman moving through something significant with particular grace. Then she picked up her own pen. We were discussing the first cohort, 12 women in tech leadership, initial grants of $50,000 each. Right. Victoria made a note. I want to increase that, 75. If we're doing this, we do it in a way that actually moves the needle. Sarah smiled. Agreed. And the timeline for the announcement... 6 weeks, Victoria said. I want it out before the quarter ends. She paused. I want my name on it, not my husband's. Mine. The word my landed with a quiet, clean finality that didn't require elaboration. Sarah simply nodded. Your name, she confirmed. At 11 that same Thursday morning, Chloe Carter sat in the office of a career consultant named Gregory Wells, holding a printed copy of her resume with a grip that was slightly too tight. She had called Gregory's office Wednesday afternoon after the third unanswered call to Daniel and the second careful read of the severance envelope from Hayes Dynamics. She had booked the earliest available appointment. Gregory was 60, practical, and entirely without sentimentality about the realities of professional reputation management. He had looked at her resume for 4 minutes without speaking. You were at Hayes Dynamics for 2 years, he said. 2.5. In what capacity at the end? Senior project coordinator for the Nexus expansion. He looked up. The Nexus expansion that has been frozen pending a credit review. She held his gaze. Yes. And your departure was separation, she said. Effective Tuesday. Gregory put the resume down. He folded his hands on his desk. He was the kind of man who delivered difficult information without dressing it up, which Chloe had found refreshing in the abstract and was finding considerably less comfortable in practice. "Chloe, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me directly." "Okay." "The social media coverage from Tuesday's gala, are you the individual referenced?" The pause before her answer was half a second too long. "Yes." Gregory nodded once. He picked up his pen. He did not write anything with it. He just held it. "Here's the situation as I see it, and I want to be honest with you, because that's the only way I can actually help. Your professional profile is currently attached to a story that has significant circulation in exactly the circles where you need to be building your next opportunity. That's the bad news." He paused. "The good news is that professional reputations are not permanent in either direction. They're built and rebuilt over time with consistent visible work that overrides the previous narrative." "How much time?" she asked. He looked at her with the careful honesty of a man who had been in this business long enough to know the difference between kindness and accuracy. "That depends significantly on what the story does over the next few weeks. If it fades 12 to 18 months of consistent work in a different sector, different circles, and you're building something new." He paused. "If it doesn't fade, how do I make it fade?" "You don't. You simply don't feed it. No statements, no responses, no engagement with any of it on any platform." He set the pen down. "The worst thing you can do right now is be visible in relation to this story. The best thing you can do is become visible in relation to something entirely different." Chloe looked at the resume in her hands, at the career she had spent 7 years building, at the trajectory she had mapped for herself, the ambition that had felt until approximately 60 hours ago like a reasonable and achievable thing. She thought about Eleanor Whitmore's voice in the ballroom. "You mistook borrowed attention for power." She had understood the words at the time, or she had thought she understood them. She was understanding them more completely now, sitting in a career consultant's office on a Thursday morning with a severance envelope in her bag and a phone that Daniel Hayes was not answering. "What sector?" she asked. Gregory's expression shifted slightly towards something that might have been respect for the directness of the question, for the speed with which she had moved from the emotional processing to the practical. "Something where your project coordination skills transfer, but where the social profile of the Hayes situation doesn't follow. Nonprofit sector potentially, or corporate social responsibility roles in companies outside this particular industry ecosystem." He paused. "You have real skills, Chloe. The resume shows that clearly. This is not the end of a career. It's a hard redirect." She nodded. She folded the resume and put it in her bag. She stood up. "I'll call your assistant about a follow-up appointment." "Good." He stood as well. "And Chloe?" He waited until she looked at him. "I mean it about the visibility. Stay quiet. Let it move past you." She walked out into the sharp morning and stood on the sidewalk and let the cold air hit her face and thought about staying quiet and what it felt like to be someone who needed to let a story move past her. 3 days ago, she had been the one making the story. She had stood up in a ballroom and made herself the story deliberately and boldly, and with complete confidence that the story would go the way she intended. It had not gone the way she intended. She started walking. She didn't have anywhere specific to be. She just needed to move. Friday arrived with a specific quality that Daniel had come to associate with the worst periods of his professional life, the strange, suspended quality of days when large things were in motion and you had no control over them. He went to his office. He had meetings. He said the right things in the right order with the right expressions and the managed composure of a man who had been performing competence for so long it had become muscle memory. At 2 p.m, his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't immediately recognize. Then he read the text and understood. It was from Richard Pratt, not from Pratt's assistant, not from Pratt's office, from Pratt himself directly, which meant Pratt was having a conversation he didn't want on record through official channels. The text read, "Lunch next week. Off the books. There may be a restructuring conversation worth having. My fund your tech assets. Come alone." Daniel read it twice. Then he understood what Pratt was actually saying in the elegant coded language of men who had been doing this long enough to never say the thing directly. Pratt wasn't offering to save Hayes Dynamics. Pratt was offering to acquire pieces of it at distressed prices. Pratt was circling. And the fact that Pratt was already circling 4 days after the gala meant that the market had moved faster than even Daniel had understood. It meant that people had already made their assessments, and those assessments were not recoverable through any narrative his PR firm could construct. He put the phone down. He looked at his hands on his desk, the hands of a man who had built something real, genuinely real, who had had a genuine talent that was not in question regardless of everything else, and he felt underneath the dread and the loss and the particular humiliation of a public unraveling something unexpected. Relief. It was small. It was uncomfortable. He didn't fully trust it. But it was there. The faint clarifying relief of a man who had been running at a pace he couldn't sustain, carrying the weight of a performance that had become heavier every year, living inside the growing gap between what he projected and what he actually felt, and who was now in the wreckage of everything falling apart, at least done pretending. He had been pretending for a long time, not just about the affair, about everything, about how solid the foundation was, about how much of it was truly his, and how much was the invisible scaffolding of the Whitmore name, and the Whitmore money, and the Whitmore network of relationships that had it turned out been holding up considerably more of his empire than he had ever been willing to admit. He thought about Victoria, about the woman he had married who had loved him. He had never doubted she loved him, and whom he had repaid by slowly, methodically dismantling the trust she had placed in him, and by doing it in public in front of 600 people with a champagne glass and a speech about following his heart. He thought about what she had said on the phone. "That's finished. I'm coming because we were together for 12 years and you deserved one real conversation." One real conversation, after 12 years. This was what it had come down to, the final accounting of a marriage reduced to 1 hour at the Hazel Room on a Saturday morning. He thought about who he had been when he married her, the hungry, scrappy 32-year-old with the big ideas and the real intelligence, and the genuine belief that he could build something from almost nothing if he worked hard enough and was smart enough and never stopped moving. He thought about when that man had started disappearing, when the performance had started to eat the person. He couldn't pinpoint it exactly. That was the thing about slow changes, they didn't announce themselves. They just accumulated quietly until one day you looked in the mirror and the person looking back was mostly costume. Saturday morning came with the kind of pale, clear light that arrived in the city in the early fall cold, at the edges, clean in the middle. The Hazel Room was a quiet place, the kind of coffee shop that serious people chose for serious conversations, because it was not the kind of place you went to be seen. Small tables, good coffee. The sound of the city slightly muted, slightly manageable. Victoria arrived at 9:58. She was wearing what she wore when she wasn't performing anything for anyone. Dark jeans, a cashmere sweater. Her hair simple. No jewelry except the watch her father had given her when she turned 40. She looked in this context both entirely like herself and like someone Daniel felt he was seeing clearly for the first time in years. He was already there. He stood when she entered, which he had always done, which was one of those genuine things about him that had survived every other deterioration. She sat. A server came. They ordered coffee. And then when the server left and the table was quiet, they looked at each other across 2 feet of small wooden table in the clear morning light. "You look tired," she said. "I am." He didn't dress it up. "The board is moving toward a formal review. Pratt is circling. The Vancouver expansion is dead." He paused. "The company it's in trouble, Victoria. Real trouble." She held her coffee cup. "I know." Was that the plan, to take the company down?" She met his eyes steadily. "The plan," she said carefully, "was to protect what my family helped build, and to make sure that when this marriage ended, it ended on terms that were clear. That's all." "Julian has been threading those contract clauses for years," he said. "Since the beginning. Were you always—" "No." Her voice was firm. "Julian built protections, standard legal protections for family capital. I didn't weaponize them until you made it necessary." A pause. "You made it very public, Daniel. You made it impossible to handle privately." He looked at her. "I know." Why?" she asked. Not with anger, with genuine curiosity, the way a person asked why when they had been trying to understand something for a long time and had not been able to get there on their own. He was quiet for a moment. Then, because I was a coward, he said, I didn't know how to end it honestly, so I forced the situation to end it for me. He looked at the table. That's not an excuse, it's just what happened. She absorbed this. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who was hearing something she had suspected and was finding that the confirmation brought neither satisfaction nor particular pain, just clarity. Did you love her? The question was quiet and entirely serious. He took a long time to answer it. I was desperate, I think, for something that felt uncomplicated. He stopped. No, I don't think it was love. I think it was avoidance. Victoria nodded slowly. She looked at her coffee. I loved you, she said. I want you to know that. For a long time, I genuinely loved you. The past tense landed between them with a weight that was gentle and final and complete. I know, he said. I know you did. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the city moved. Inside, the Hazel room was quiet. What happens now? He asked. Julian will be in touch about the legal process, she said. It will be handled professionally. I'm not interested in prolonging it or in spectacle. She paused. I want it finished cleanly. And the company... She met his eyes. That's not my responsibility anymore, Daniel. It hasn't been for a long time. She said it without cruelty. She said it like a fact, which was what it was. He nodded. He looked at his hands around his coffee cup. What are you going to do after? And for the first time in the conversation, something shifted in her expression. Not toward grief, not toward anger, but toward something forward-facing. Something that had its own quiet energy. I'm building something, she said. A foundation. Women in tech and leadership. Dr. Sarah Chen and I have been working on the framework for months. She paused. It's real. It's good. I'm excited about it. He looked at her face when she said, I'm excited about it. He saw the truth of it, the genuine, unperformed energy behind the words. He saw the woman who had been sitting inside the composed, elegant, managed presentation for 12 years, waiting for enough space to become fully herself. You'll be extraordinary at it, he said, and he meant it, even now, especially now. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said, not with arrogance, with the quiet, grounded certainty of a woman who had finally stopped waiting for permission to believe it. She finished her coffee. She put on her coat. She stood. Take care of yourself, Daniel, she said. I mean that. He stood. Victoria. He waited until she looked at him fully. I'm sorry, that's inadequate. I know it's inadequate. But I need you to know that I know what I had and what I did with it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, not with forgiveness exactly, not yet, but with the acknowledgement of a woman who had heard something true and was willing to let it be true without requiring anything further from it. She turned and walked toward the door. The morning light caught her as she pushed it open, pale and clean and clear, and she walked out into it without looking back. Daniel sat back down. The server came and refilled his coffee without asking. He sat with it for a long time, watching the door she had walked through and thinking about extraordinary and what it meant that he had been the one to say it and that she had been the one to already know it. Outside, Victoria stood on the sidewalk in the sharp Saturday morning and took a breath of cold air that tasted for the first time in a long time entirely like her own. Her phone buzzed. Sarah Chen framework document is ready. When can you review? She typed back Monday morning. Let's finalize the announcement timeline. She put her phone in her pocket. She started walking. The city opened up around her, large and indifferent and full of possibility. And Victoria Whitmore, daughter of Augustus, and Eleanor, sister of Julian, formerly wife of Daniel Hayes, and shortly to be none of those things in the way she had been, any of them, walked into it with the specific, unhurried certainty of a woman who knew exactly where she was going. 6 weeks after the gala, the announcement went out on a Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. sharp, not through a press release, not through a publicist, through Victoria Whitmore's own voice in a direct statement posted simultaneously across 3 platforms, accompanied by the framework document she and Sarah Chen had spent 6 weeks building with the focused, energized precision of 2 women who had been waiting for exactly this kind of space to do exactly this kind of work. The Whitmore Chen Foundation for Women in Technology and Leadership. Initial funding of $12 million. First cohort 15 women. Grants of $75,000 each plus 18 months of mentorship network access and board-level sponsorship. Applications open in 30 days. Her phone started ringing at 9:04. The first call was from Margot. "I'm crying," Margot said without any preamble. "I'm standing in my kitchen and I'm actually crying." "Please don't," Victoria said. But she was smiling, genuinely without performance. "We haven't done anything yet. We've just announced." "Victoria." Margot's voice was firm in the way of old friends who would not be redirected. "You know that's not true. You know exactly what you've done." A pause. "How does it feel?" Victoria stood at the window of her new office, not the family residence, not any space that carried the weight of the last 12 years, but a clean, bright space she had signed the lease on 2 weeks ago with her name only on the paperwork. "It feels like the first thing in a long time that belongs entirely to me," she said. Margot was quiet for a moment. Then, "Good, that's exactly what it should feel like." The second call was from Augustus. He did not say much. He said, "I saw the announcement." A pause. "Your mother is very proud." Another pause slightly longer. "So am I." And then he ended the call before she could respond, which was completely characteristic and which made her eyes sting briefly and unexpectedly in the way that her father's particular form of love had always managed to reach her sideways. The third call at 9:22 was from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. Then something made her pick up. "Ms. Whitmore," a woman's voice, professional, slightly careful. "My name is Andrea Park. I'm a reporter with the Financial Leadership Journal. We've been covering the announcement this morning, and I'd love to, if you have even 15 minutes to talk about the Foundation's goals and your vision for—" "Send your questions to my assistant," Victoria said. "I'll have responses back to you by end of day." "Of course. I also wanted to ask, and please feel free to decline whether you'd be willing to speak to the personal context. The last several weeks have been—" "The Foundation stands on its own merits," Victoria said. Her voice was pleasant. It was also completely final. "It doesn't require any other context. Send the questions." She ended the call. She looked at the phone in her hand. Then she set it on her desk and went back to the document she was reviewing the evaluation criteria for the first cohort applications, and she did not think about the personal context again that morning. Across the city, Daniel Hayes read the announcement at 9:15, sitting at the desk in an office that felt increasingly like a room he was borrowing from someone else. He read it twice. He looked at the $12 million figure and thought about the Whitmore family's resources and what it meant that Victoria had moved this fast and this deliberately in 6 weeks. He looked at the Foundation's name, Whitmore Chen, her name first, her name without Hayes anywhere in its architecture, and he felt the specific, complicated mix of things he had been feeling for 6 weeks and had not yet found a clean way to hold. Pride was in there. He had not expected pride, but it was genuinely there. He knew her. He knew what this kind of initiative required: the vision and the execution and the willingness to put your name on something that could fail publicly. And he knew she had all of it, had always had all of it. And he knew with the specific clarity of a man reviewing his own history that he had not for a long time been giving that the space it deserved. Regret was in there. That was not a surprise. And underneath both of those, something quieter and more honest, a kind of recognition. The recognition of a man who had spent 15 years building something that was now coming apart, watching a woman build something that was just beginning, and understanding that, of the two trajectories, hers was the one that would last. His assistant knocked. Patricia Osei's office called. "The formal performance review is scheduled for next Thursday." A pause. "And your attorney called. The divorce filing has been received. He wants to go over the response." "Tell him I'll call this afternoon," Daniel said without turning from the window. And Richard Pratt's office confirmed lunch on Friday. Fine. She left. Daniel stayed at the window. The city did what cities did. It moved indifferently and continuously in every direction at once. He thought about the Pratt lunch, about what it would mean to sit across from a man who was circling the company he had built and discuss in the elegant coded language of financial dismantlement what pieces were worth taking and at what price. He thought about what it felt like to be on this side of that conversation. He had been on the other side before years ago, before Hayes Dynamics, when he was the one doing the acquiring, the one with the leverage and the certainty. The reversal was not subtle. He thought about Victoria's voice in the Hazel room on Saturday. "Take care of yourself, Daniel." The way she had said it, not as a formality, not as the polite nothing that people said when they meant nothing. She had meant it. She had looked at him and meant it. And that was possibly the hardest thing about the entire conversation, harder than any of the legal mechanics or the financial unraveling, because it meant that she had not left with hatred. She had left with something much more complicated and much more final than hatred. She had left with the clear-eyed compassion of a woman who understood exactly what had happened and had chosen for her own reasons to release it cleanly. You couldn't fight clear-eyed compassion. You couldn't argue with it or negotiate with it or find the angle that made it reversible. It simply was what it was. He picked up his phone. He called his attorney. He said, "I want the process to be as clean as she wants it to be. Whatever she's asking for, if it's reasonable, we agree. I don't want this to go long." His attorney was quiet for a moment. "Daniel, I need to advise you that there are some asset questions that—" "I understand the asset questions," Daniel said. "I'm telling you my priority. Clean and fast. Whatever's fair." Another pause. "Okay, I'll communicate that to the Whitmore legal team." "To Julian," Daniel said. "Directly to Julian." He ended the call. He thought about Julian Whitmore, who had spent years quietly embedding protective architecture into the legal structure of his company, and who had executed the unwinding of it with surgical, unhurried precision. He had resented it for the first week. Then he had stopped resenting it, because resentment required a version of events in which he was the wronged party, and he could not, in honest accounting, construct that version. Julian had protected his sister. That was all. Daniel would have done the same for someone he loved. The thought arrived without warning and carried its own specific sting. Someone he loved. He would have done it for someone he loved. The implicit question underneath that completed itself before he could stop it. He pushed back from the window. He had work to do. Whatever remained of it, he had work to do. 3 weeks after the foundation announcement, the first major profile piece ran. Not in a gossip column, not in the society pages in the business section of a national publication, under the headline, "Whitmore Chen Foundation signals a new model for philanthropic investment in women's leadership." The piece ran 1,200 words. It quoted Victoria extensively on the foundation's philosophy, its evaluation criteria, its vision for long-term impact. It quoted Sarah Chen on the partnership and the framework. It quoted 2 of the women who had already been named as first cohort recipients, both of whom spoke with the specific contained emotion of people who had been waiting for exactly this kind of support and had not known whether it would ever arrive. The piece mentioned Daniel Hayes in one sentence in the 7th paragraph as Victoria's estranged husband. It mentioned the gala in half a sentence. Then it moved on. Victoria read that paragraph twice. The reduction of 12 years to one sentence in the 7th paragraph of a story about something she had built herself felt she was surprised to discover not like diminishment, but like accuracy, like the story correcting its own proportions. She sent the piece to Sarah with a single line. "This is what we're building," Sarah wrote back. "This is just the beginning." The week the profile ran, the foundation received 412 applications for the first cohort. They had projected 80. Victoria called Sarah at 7 in the evening from her office, still at her desk, and said, "We're going to need a larger review committee." "Already on it," Sarah said. "I called 3 people this afternoon. All 3 said yes before I finished the sentence." Victoria leaned back in her chair. Outside her window, the city was moving into evening, the light shifting toward the particular golden amber of early fall. "Did you see the number?" 412, Sarah said. "I refreshed the page 6 times. "We built something real," Victoria said. She said it quietly, almost to herself. "We did," Sarah confirmed. No performance in it, just the plain, solid truth of it. 412 women who had needed exactly this thing, who had been waiting for someone to build exactly this thing, and who had found it in the 6 weeks since a woman walked out of a charity ballroom and decided that the rest of her life would belong entirely to her. The divorce was finalized on a gray Wednesday morning in late October. Julian handled everything as he had promised. It was clean as Daniel had promised. The legal process moved with a speed that surprised even the attorneys involved, because both parties had decided for their own separate reasons that prolonging it served no one. Victoria signed the final documents in Julian's office at 10 in the morning. Julian was across the desk from her, professional and present, and when she set down the pen after the last signature, he looked at her for a moment with the expression he reserved for the few things that genuinely moved him. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she agreed. He closed the folder. He set it aside, and then he did something he had not done in as long as she could remember. He came around the desk, and he put his arms around his sister and held on for a moment briefly and completely in the way of siblings who knew each other well enough not to need to say the things they were holding. She let herself be held for exactly that moment. Then she stepped back. She straightened her jacket. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." "Always," he said, "just that." She walked out of his office and into the elevator and down to the street, and she stood on the sidewalk in the gray October morning and felt the specific quality of a thing being finished. Not the dramatic finish of the gala evening, not the held breath and the ballroom doors and the arrival of the dynasty. Just the quiet administrative finish of paperwork signed and witnessed and filed, the legal end of something that had ended in every real sense weeks before. She called her mother. Eleanor picked up on the second ring. "How are you free?" Victoria said. The word surprised her as it came out. She hadn't planned, it hadn't reached for it, it had simply arrived as the accurate one. "I feel free, Mom." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had something in it that Victoria very rarely heard, something soft and unguarded, the voice of a woman, before the composure, before the decades of careful social management, before all of it. "Good," Eleanor said. "That's exactly how you should feel." They stayed on the line for a moment without speaking, mother and daughter, in the particular comfortable silence of women who understood each other. "Dinner Sunday," Eleanor said finally. "Yes," Victoria said. "I'll bring the wine." She put her phone in her pocket. She looked up at the gray sky, and then she started walking toward her office, toward the 412 applications waiting for her review committee, toward the announcement timeline and the funding schedule and the work, the real and consequential, and hers work that was already in motion. 2 weeks later, Daniel Hayes sat across from Richard Pratt at a private club downtown and listened to a number. The number was real. It was not what the company was worth at its peak, not by a significant margin, but it was real, a genuine offer for the core technology assets and the Nexus platform, which was the part of Hayes Dynamics that had always been the most genuinely his, the thing he had built from actual intelligence and actual vision before the scaffolding had become load-bearing. Pratt slid a term sheet across the table. "It's a fair offer, Daniel. Given the current circumstances, it's more than fair." Daniel looked at the term sheet. He thought about 11 weeks of runway, about the board review, about the institutional investors who had not rescheduled, about the 214 shares on social media that had become 600, then 1,000, about the invisible architecture that had been holding his empire up without his full acknowledgement and which had been quietly, systematically removed. He thought about being 32 and hungry and genuinely brilliant and walking into a room ready to build something. He thought about the distance between that man and this one, and whether the distance was entirely loss or whether some of it strangely, uncomfortably was clarification. "I'll have my attorney review it," he said. "Of course." Pratt leaned back. He was not unkind, he was simply a man of business doing what men of business did. "Daniel, for what it's worth, the Nexus platform is genuinely exceptional. Whatever the circumstances, you built something real there." Daniel looked at him. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it, which was its own particular complicated thing. He signed the term sheet 3 weeks later. The announcement of the partial acquisition ran on a Thursday. By that evening, the Hayes Dynamics story, the gala, the board review, the credit line, all of it had been absorbed into the larger business narrative of a restructuring which was, the way these things eventually went, dramatic in the personal register, administrative in the public one. He had enough. He had more than enough. He had the proceeds of 15 years of genuine work, even with the scaffolding removed. He had the Nexus technology because he had negotiated to retain a minority stake, which was the one thing he had refused to give up completely. He had a reputation that was damaged, but not destroyed, because damage and destruction were different things, and he had learned in the last 3 months to be precise about the difference. He had his next idea. It had been forming since October, in the quiet hours after the office emptied, and he sat alone at his desk with the specific, uncomfortable creativity of a man who had been stripped down to what was actually his, and was finding that what was actually his was still genuinely interesting. He started writing it down in November, just notes at first, then a framework, then a pitch deck that he built himself without a team, without support staff, the way he had built the first one 15 years ago in a 2-room office with bad lighting and unlimited ambition. It felt unexpectedly like coming home to something. In December, Victoria received an invitation. It came to her office, addressed to her, not to Mrs. Hayes, not to the Whitmore family, to Victoria Whitmore Foundation Director, and it was from a consortium of women in finance and technology who were convening a summit in January and wanted her to keynote. She read the invitation twice. Then she called Sarah. "They want me to keynote the Ascend Summit," she said. "I know," Sarah said. "I may have suggested your name when they called me last month." Sarah. "You're ready," Sarah said, simply, without hedging. "You've been ready. This is just the room finally being the right size." Victoria looked at the invitation. She thought about standing in the center of the Fairmont Royal York Ballroom 6 weeks before everything changed, watching the room watch her, waiting to see if she would break. She thought about the specific quality of not breaking, not as performance, not as strategy, but as the genuine expression of who she had always been underneath everything else. She thought about what it felt like to walk out of a room and know the story was already over, already decided, already hers. "Send them my acceptance," she said. She delivered the keynote on a Tuesday morning in January in a room of 400 women in finance and technology, on a stage with her name on the screen behind her and the Whitmore Chen Foundation logo beside it. She stood at the podium without notes. She had written them and then set them aside because notes were for uncertainty, and she was not uncertain, and she spoke for 35 minutes about power and patience and the specific discipline of waiting until you were sure. She spoke about the difference between borrowed authority and built authority, about the way real power didn't need to announce itself in ballrooms, about what it looked like to build something that lasted versus something that depended on conditions that could be removed. She did not mention Daniel by name. She did not mention the gala. She did not need to. The room understood. Rooms like this one always understood. These were women who had spent careers navigating exactly the architecture she was describing, who knew the weight of being underestimated and the specific discipline required to convert that underestimation into momentum. When she finished, the room was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then it stood up. Not polite applause, not the reflexive response of an audience fulfilling a social contract. The kind of standing that happened when something true had been said in a room full of people who needed to hear it said and who recognized the truth of it in their bones before their minds had finished processing the words. Victoria stood at the podium and let the response land. She did not deflect it. She did not minimize it with a self-deprecating gesture or a rushed thank you. She stood in it completely and without apology, because she had earned it, and because one of the things she had learned in the last 6 months was that receiving something you had earned was not arrogance, it was accuracy. She found Sarah in the front row, standing with everyone else, with the expression of a woman who had known this was coming and had arranged to be in the front row to watch it arrive. Victoria stepped back from the podium. She thought about the Fairmont Royal York and the midnight blue gown and the champagne toast and the ballroom doors opening and her father's hand taking hers. She thought about the Hazel room and the gray October morning and Julian's office and the pen signing the last page of a life she had finished with as much grace as she could bring to finishing it. She thought about 412 women whose applications were sitting in a server that her team was reviewing, women who were waiting for someone to tell them their ambition was worth investing in, women who had been carrying their own versions of this story and needed to know that the ending was not determined by whoever had the champagne glass. She thought about what she had told her father in the ballroom. I wanted to wait until he made it public, so there would be no ambiguity. There was no ambiguity now. There had not been for months. The ambiguity had been burned away by 6 months of work and clarity and the specific, difficult freedom of building something new from a foundation that was entirely, unambiguously her own. The applause continued. The room remained standing. And Victoria Whitmore stood in it, present and forward-facing and absolutely certain, and thought about the toast. Chloe Carter had raised her champagne glass in a golden ballroom and toasted the future. She had aimed that toast like a weapon at a woman she believed she had already defeated, and she had drunk it with the full confidence of someone who had already won. She had not understood in that moment that the woman she was toasting against had already seen the future, had planned for it, prepared for it, waited with absolute patience for the exact right conditions before she moved. Had known with the unshakable certainty of someone who understood both herself and the architecture of power she had grown up inside that the toast was not a defeat, it was a trigger. And what it had triggered, this foundation, this stage, this room of 400 people standing, this work that was only beginning, this life being built on ground that was entirely her own, was not a response to Chloe Carter, was not a revenge on Daniel Hayes, was not a performance for anyone in any ballroom. It was simply Victoria Whitmore, finally completely without apology or qualification, taking up the full amount of space she had always been entitled to occupy. The mistress had toasted her victory. She had toasted it in front of the wrong woman. And the wrong woman had walked out of that ballroom and built something that would outlast every single thing that had been broken in that room by decades. Something real and consequential and growing, something with 412 names already attached to it, and thousands more to come, something that did not require a ballroom or a champagne glass or anyone else's acknowledgement to be exactly, completely, permanently what it was. Power does not beg, it does not perform, it does not raise its voice in a room full of people and demand to be seen. It simply builds quietly and with absolute intention until the building is so undeniable that the room has no choice but to recognize what was always already there. That was the lesson the gala never forgot. That was the thing Chloe Carter's toast had triggered, and Daniel Hayes' empire had collapsed to reveal, and 6 months of deliberate, focused, unhurried work had made permanent. Victoria Whitmore had not won the night of the gala. She had simply been the only person in the room who already knew how the story ended, and then she had gone home and slept and gotten up the next morning and built it.